Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to another exciting intellectual evening with the Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought. I want to recognize Moshe Straus, the chairman of Yeshiva's board and our partner in all that we do at the Straus Center. I want to welcome as well Yeshiva's provost, Selma Botman. I thank, as always, our assistant director, Stu Halpern, for his incredible work at the Straus Center, both in preparing for this evening and for ensuring the success of all of our efforts. And I thank as well Alan Sector, our partner for the Straus Center and Institutional Advancement. Special thanks goes to Daniel Mayle for ensuring that this evening came together. I not only have the extraordinary privilege of serving as the director of the Straus Center, but also the honor of serving as Shearith Israel's rabbi. And so I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our magnificent sanctuary here this evening, and to recognize and to thank our Parnas, Lou Solomon. And finally, I want to express my gratitude to Major League Baseball for not scheduling a World Series game tonight. Henry Kissinger is known for his countless quotes and quips, many of them extremely amusing, such as, "The nice thing about being a celebrity is that if you bore people, they think it's their fault." And, quote, "The longer I am out of office, the more infallible I appear to myself," end quote. But one of the most serious and profound Kissingerisms is this: history is to nations what character is to individuals. The purpose of the Straus Center is to study the intellectual history of the West and to ponder the impact of the Jews upon it, and thereby achieve a better understanding of our very selves. Tonight we welcome one of the world's great historians who has written prolifically and prophetically about the past and future of the West and the role of the Jews in the West. Niall Ferguson is the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard University. He is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and the author of 14 books, including Civilization, The West and the Rest, and The World's Banker, The History of the House of Rothschild. Now, he has produced the first volume of his biography of the man who is surely the most powerful and influential Jewish American of the 20th century and probably in American history, Kissinger. The book has received rave reviews, with one article echoing many others by saying that, quote, "If Ferguson's second volume is as good as the first," no pressure, Kissinger will be remembered as Ferguson's masterpiece, ranking alongside Edmund Morris's treatment of Teddy Roosevelt and David Gilmour's account of Curzon as one of the great biographies of statesmen. Professor Ferguson once reflected on his own origins by saying that, quote, "Scottish Calvinism gave rise to impulses comparable to those we associate with Jews in the modern period. A high regard for literacy, an emphasis on education as a route to social mobility, an aptitude for finance and for science." And Professor Ferguson added, quote, "Through it all, I have become a thorough Philo-Semite," end quote. That's wonderful to hear. And let me just say, speaking as a Jew, many of us are big fans of Niall Ferguson as well, and are so delighted that he's come here tonight to discuss Kissinger, America, and the Jews. Please join me in welcoming our guest. Professor Ferguson, let's start with Judaism. For me, one of the most striking parts in the book is reading about Henry Kissinger's religious childhood. Let's begin with the earliest known piece of writing by Henry Kissinger to survive to this day. Kissinger, writing this, is 14 years old in Fürth, Germany, and he is serving as the secretary for his local Agudas Yisrael youth group. This is a note written by Henry Kissinger's own hand that may have seemed strange to many of your readers, but I think will strike a chord with many of those here in the audience today. And I quote from page 69, Henry Kissinger, 14 years old, writing about his meeting. Quote, "We met in our room punctually," he is a Yeka after all, punctually at 3:45 p.m. And then Kissinger describes what he did as a 14-year-old in this meeting. First, we discussed dinim. We set out the dinim about teves. We talked about muktzah. One distinguishes between 4 forms of muktzah. Muktzah machmas isser, muktzah machmas mitzvah, muktzah machmas avera, muktzah machmas mius. Then, writes Henry Kissinger, there is also a 5th form of muktzah. For example, when one says before Shabbos that one will not take something if it is muktzah for the relevant Shabbos. Then, writes Kissinger, it was time to see who was the best in the group at remembering these dinim of Hilchos Shabbos. The decision was reached, he wrote, that Heinz Lyon and I each received half a point. And then he concludes as follows, quote, then we discussed the impending partition of Palestine. A partition would be the greatest Chilul Hashem in the history of the world. A Jewish state governed not by the Torah, but by the general law code is unthinkable. That was the end of the meeting. Signed, Heinz Kissinger. Now, this is incredible. And so I guess the first question that many of us want to know is, what if anything of this boy that we meet at the beginning of the book remains in the Henry Kissinger that at the end of the book becomes Richard Nixon's national security advisor?
Well, thank you for asking me the most difficult question that I've been asked in 5 weeks of book tour. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight. And it's also rather humbling because it feels more presumptuous than ever for a guy from Glasgow to try to write the biography of a man like Henry Kissinger, and above all, for a guy from Glasgow to try to understand the milieu from which Kissinger came. I spent a substantial part of my life trying to understand Jewish history, and it began in a fairly classic way at Oxford many years ago with the German problem, the German catastrophe, what on earth had gone wrong? And trying to answer that question impelled me to Hamburg to write about the German hyperinflation. And it was in Hamburg that I first really came into contact with the German Jews in the archive of the Warburg or Warburg Bank. That led by a somewhat circuitous route to the history of the Rothschild Bank that you mentioned. But, you know, to go from studying the Warburgs and Rothschilds to studying the Kissingers, as they were, in Fürth, is really to make an enormous leap into a quite unfamiliar world of South German orthodoxy. Your question, how much of that young boy, devout, attentive to his religious duties, survived? A lot, of course, but the simple question, the simple answer to your question, and the superficial answer is the religion didn't. And what we need to explore this evening, I think, is why that was. You can't really explain Kissinger's loss of religious faith without talking about World War II. And I know I'm sure we'll come to that in our conversation. But even before you get to that, it's important to remember that not long after he wrote those minutes of the meeting, he was uprooted and transported across the Atlantic, along with a substantial number of other Jews from Fürth and indeed from Germany, to this city. And we read so much in the newspapers these days about refugees going to Germany. It's hard for the historian not to think how full of irony the past is, because in the 1930s, the refugees were pouring out of Germany. And Henry Kissinger was one of those refugees who found himself at age 15 in Washington Heights, part of the city you know well, having to start over, and having to start over at an age when life is difficult enough. I'm pretty sure 15 is the most difficult age. It certainly felt like that to me. And I didn't have any of the upheaval that the young Heinz Kissinger endured. He had to go from being the schoolmaster's son, one of the schoolmaster's two sons, who had witnessed his father and his own civil rights whittled away from 1933 until 1938, who had found the pleasures of life withdrawn one by one. The young Kissinger's great pleasure was soccer. And I don't think he was an especially political young man, and it may be that he loved soccer even more than he loved the finer points of Mukhtar. But it's all taken away, and then even home is taken away, and you have to start all over again. I think that was the beginning of a process of alienation or of estrangement that ultimately led him to the loss of his religious faith. That doesn't mean the young man you just described was altogether lost. And one of the things that I really want to try and bring out, and I've tried to bring it out in this book, is that although Kissinger formally ceased to be observant, he still thought of himself as a Jew. And he continued in many respects to behave with that punctiliousness that the letter conveys. He's a very writerly individual. One way that it was possible for me to write this book is the fact that this is just the beginning of an enormous body of writing that he kept up through his life. Letters, diaries, unpublished essays. You can't really write the inner life of someone unless they do that. So that did survive, and something of the tone of the document that you've just quoted from is there even in 1968.
Fascinating. So let's examine this further by taking a journey through the early part of his life. As you mentioned, the refugees, they go to Washington Heights. His parents daven at Breuer's. He attends George Washington High School and then City College, where he studies accounting. And this is his career path. Plain, nothing extraordinary. So just speaking counterfactually for a moment, had Kissinger never been drafted, would he have just been some accountant living in the suburbs, modern Orthodox accountant? And what does that tell us, if that's the case, about, as a historian, about the contingencies of history?
Whenever I think of Henry Kissinger as an accountant, I have this vision of the worst audit you ever went through. And, there are corporations all over the world that don't know how lucky they are that it didn't happen. History should teach us, though it tends not to, that contingency dominates, that chance and uncertainty dominate. But unfortunately, most history is taught as a kind of inevitable, teleological narrative in which one thing leads inexorably to another. One of the advantages of writing a biography, as opposed to some of the larger scale books I've written, is that you can get at that role of chance and realize that chance just kept intervening in this young man's life, and sometimes saving his life. After all, just to take the story back a moment, if they hadn't left, as the Kissingers did in the summer of 1938, if they had opted to stay in Germany, then Henry Kissinger would almost certainly have been killed in the Holocaust, because all the members of the family who stayed in Germany died, including Kissinger's own grandmother. At least 13 close relatives. If you look at the whole family tree, you get close to double that number, lost their lives. So the first piece of luck is just that Paula Kissinger, his mother, had the nous, had the vim and the vigor to say, we've got to go. We've got to get out. And then had the good fortune to have a relative already in the United States who could help them secure the visa. So that's the first luck in this man's life. And then it's the strangest kind of luck. World War II saves Kissinger from the life of a suburban accountant, which I think, paradoxical though it sounds, must be true. He was a good student, but remember, it was pretty tough. He didn't have much English when he got here, and although he was studying at an excellent high school, he was studying nights. By day, because the family had no money, he was working in a shaving brush factory way downtown, and then going back up to Washington Heights to study. It was difficult. His father couldn't earn. He really took ages to find any kind of employment. And his mother, for many years, as I'm sure some of you know, worked as a caterer. So the pressure to earn was intense. And there would simply not have been the remotest possibility at that point of Henry Kissinger ending up at Harvard. That was one of the many unexpected consequences of the war. I also think, and this is one of the most important points I make in the book, that the war was the searing, transformative experience of his life. And it was transformative in a whole range of ways, which I'm sure you'll want to talk about, Rabbi. But that seems to me clear. Had he not been drafted and turned into an American soldier, his life would certainly not have led him to Harvard, and from Harvard into the corridors of power.
Wow. So at the age of 19, Kissinger is drafted, and it's in the army that he meets another person with an odd mix of Germanic pretensions and Jewish descent, and that's Fritz Kramer. You call him the Mephistopheles to Kissinger's Faust. Who is this guy, and why is he so central to Kissinger's life?
Well, Fritz Kramer was a rather outlandish figure who gave the impression that he was a Prussian conservative.
And he's Jewish.
It turns out. But this was something that was very carefully concealed. He wore a monocle and riding boots, really rather a self-caricature of a German.
Sounds like something from Hogan's Heroes or something like that, yeah.
Right, and there was enormous comic quality to this man. He was another refugee from the Nazis. It was through our research, I say our because my indefatigable research assistant, Jason Rocket, made the discovery that we found that Kramer actually came from a Jewish family. It was not, in fact, something that he talked about. And indeed, I think we were the first to realize that his father had indeed died in the Holocaust. Kramer had invented himself somewhere across the Atlantic, I guess, as a Prussian conservative exile from Germany. They met in a training camp in Louisiana, which must have been a pretty unpleasant place. You can forget about air conditioning at that time, and certainly in that kind of camp. They were both privates. Although Kramer acted the officer, he was a private in the US Army. But he was a private who was very overqualified. He already had a PhD. He'd studied under some of the most eminent thinkers about international law in the interwar period. He was a highly learned man, and he also knew, of course, a great deal about Germany. And the army had given him the job of giving pep talks to the troops along the lines of, go tell them why we have to beat the Krauts, because you are one. And Kramer would give these speeches to the bewildered Midwestern conscripts, GIs up to their knees in Louisiana mud, and they would presumably shrug their shoulders, but one didn't. And this was young Private Kissinger, who came up to Kramer afterwards and said, "That was brilliant." And from that moment on, an extraordinary relationship formed that may have been the most important of Kissinger's life. Kramer was a learned man. He certainly thought of himself as Mephistopheles, and he thought of Kissinger as Faust. He was the one who spotted Kissinger's intellect, and he spotted it with remarkable insight. In the course of conversations, Kramer realizes that this is something very special. Some of you here I know are teachers, and you'll remember if you've taught for any length of time. I've been teaching for 25 years. Every now and then you come across that strange magic of intellectual excellence. That's what Kramer saw in Kissinger. And it was Kramer who said, "You're wasting your time with this accountancy business, and you can't possibly go back to City College of New York. After the war, you have to go to one of the great universities and fulfill your destiny as a historian." And it was Kramer's insight that Kissinger had some kind of exceptional feel for history as a discipline. So you just have to imagine, and it's a slightly difficult thing to imagine, these two incongruous figures, both in fact German Jews, but one pretending to be a Prussian conservative, both in army fatigues. Remember, at this point, it's hard to believe, I know, but Henry Kissinger is thin. So both thin, sort of stumbling around army camps, talking about history. It's a
in
really
Louisiana.
extraordinary vision, yes. And they carry on having these conversations. They're shipped across the Atlantic. They're deployed to Germany. It's late 1944. And they go from landing on the Channel coast to the Siegfried Line. And for me, one of the most electrifying things I came across in my research was a letter that Kissinger wrote back to his parents at the end of 1944. And he's put at the top, "Somewhere in Germany." And he wrote to them, "It's very late. I just had to write to tell you so that I could write somewhere in Germany. I am back where I want to be. I am back on German soil. And Germany now knows what war is. And those people who committed such atrocities now know what it is to be on the receiving end. And I'm proud to be here as an American soldier." Notice, this letter written in English to his parents back in Washington Heights. An extraordinary, spine-tingling letter. But you've got to imagine Kissinger and Kramer going through these experiences together, and later going through the terrifying experience of the Battle of the Bulge, when it seemed as if the German army might achieve one last great breakthrough on the Western Front.
So that's actually the perfect segue to returning to the question of Kissinger's Jewishness, because I, too, found that letter in the book spine-tingling, and it resonated with me when he says, "I'm here now as an American." But what he doesn't mention is being back as a Jew, and the community and the people who have been murdered. You mentioned that, as you describe, you describe that he then works in Army counterintelligence, and then after the war in the denazification effort in Germany. But what you look for in his writings, like in those letters, is some personal remark about his own Jewishness. And I just can't find it. You have this remarkable essay he writes when he discovers a concentration camp, which he calls The Eternal Jew, this essay. But even that is about humanity and how humanity is shamed by this. And I want to, you note that Kissinger said, quote, about the Holocaust, "I must say that I was so shocked by the human tragedy that I did not put it immediately into direct relationship to myself. When I came back to Germany, of course, I experienced aspects of the Holocaust in a way that were unimaginable when I was a child. But those were then from the point of view of a member of the army of occupation. And so I insisted on allowing me to develop my own thinking rather than presenting myself as some traumatized victim. But surely there's some middle ground between objective universalist occupier and traumatized victim. As you mentioned in the book, you describe the statistics. His entire town, except for 40 people from Firth, of the Jewish community of Firth, his grandmother is killed. So you note in your amazing introduction that you say that, quote, to say that American Jews have been ambivalent toward the man who is arguably their community's most distinguished son would be an understatement. And that's certainly true. But isn't it true that Kissinger, throughout the distinguished career you're describing, shows a certain ambivalence about his own Jewishness, or at least how much he's willing to talk about it?
I must say that when I write about this, I do so with extreme care, because I find it extraordinarily difficult to imagine what it was for Kissinger at the age of 22 to witness the liberation of the concentration camp at Arlem and to be confronted for the first time with what he must have suspected but had not previously seen at first hand. Non-Jews, like Vernon Tott, who wrote about the experience and took photographs of the experience, were shocked to the very core of their being. And for Kissinger, who had been in Germany just 7 years before, it must have been a deeply horrific moment. So one has to put oneself in that position. And remember, at this point, he does not know the fate of his relatives. He finds that out only later when the war is over. So I think one has to make a certain allowance for the psychological defenses that one might have to erect in such a situation. The most extraordinary document in the entire book is this 2-page essay that he wrote shortly after witnessing the liberation of the concentration camp, which he entitles The Eternal Jew, an allusion, of course, to the Nazi propaganda film. It is addressed to a 16-year-old prisoner, inmate of the camp, who is maimed, starved, and brutalized to the point of scarcely seeming human. It is an intensely moving document, full, I think, of human empathy. It does not explicitly say, I could be you, but it doesn't need to. It surely doesn't need to. So I think that and I reproduce this document in full because it seems to me absolutely fundamental to our understanding of the man. I mean, it's almost worth quoting a few lines from it, just to, may I do that if I can find it hastily enough? It's worth quoting simply because it gets to the heart of the problem that we're discussing here, this fundamental problem of how do you deal with this? So let me quote a few lines from it. Volk Sama, that's the name of the 16-year-old. Humanity stands accused in you. I, Joe Smith, human dignity, everybody has failed you. You should be preserved in cement up here on the hillside for future generations to look upon and take stock. Human dignity, objective values have stopped at this barbed wire. What differentiates you and your comrades from animals? Why do we in the 20th century countenance you? Yet, Fulek, you are still human. You stand before me and tears run down your cheek. Hysterical sobbing follows. Go ahead and cry, Fulek Sama, because your tears testify to your humanity, because they will be absorbed in this cursed soil, dedicating it. As long as conscience exists as a conception in this world, you will personify it. Nothing done for you will ever restore you. You are eternal in this respect. I read that very early on, even before I had quite decided whether I should write this biography, as I was leafing through papers in boxes of Kissinger's private papers. When I read that document, I knew I had to write the book, despite the fact that it would be very difficult indeed. And I wanted to write it because I wanted to get at the heart of a man who has gone through such an experience. Now, as I mentioned earlier, somewhere along the line, and it's not quite clear where, he loses his religious faith during the war. And it's clearly a decisive break, because he tells his parents, and he tells them in stark terms, that he can no longer share their faith. And this is really especially directed at his father, who was a very devout man. This is an enormous rift in the family.
His father was observant until the end of his days.
Absolutely. Yeah? And both Kissinger and his younger brother Walter, who was in the Pacific Theatre, come back, or even before they come back from the war, tell their parents they have lost their faith.
And both intermarry.
And both intermarry, although
Kissinger
does not in the first instance.
Right.
His younger brother does in the first instance. So there's a huge rift within the family on the most fundamental of things, faith. And it's painful to read the letters that cover this rift. But what is clear is that the experiences of the war, and I think it may have been the combat even before the encounter at the concentration camp, had done to Kissinger what similar experiences did to a great many men of that generation. It shattered their pre-war beliefs. I think this is a very sincere loss of faith, one that I can understand very well, because I'm married to somebody who lost and broke with the religious faith of her family. And I know from her experience how extraordinarily painful that is, even if you've come to the conviction that it's superstition. You hurt your family by that act. And I think it's very striking how hard Kissinger tried to soften the blow when he returned in 1947 by in fact marrying the girl within the Orthodox community that his parents wanted him to marry. I think that was a very important attempt by him to at least save the familial structures from the loss of faith. But this is absolutely central to the book, absolutely central, because with Kramer, I think he is finding his way to a new philosophy, which is rooted in the Enlightenment. And at Harvard, where he goes after he returns from occupied Germany, he finds his way to a complete value system, but one that is based on 18th century European philosophy.
So he comes back to the States. He, on the GI Bill, attends Harvard, gets into Harvard, turned down by the other Ivy League universities, but that's just because he applied late or something like that. Is that right?
That's right. It's one of those, again, contingencies. He's sort of encouraged by Kramer to apply, but Kissinger has decided to stay on in Germany longer than he needed to. This is an important point. He tells his parents, I'm not coming back yet, because there's work we still have to do here to make sure that the sacrifice hasn't been futile. And one of the things that he says in these extraordinary family letters is, to his father, we cannot be completely unforgiving. We have to choose, we have to select the malefactors, the ardent Nazis, from the fellow travelers if we're to make anything of this country. And Kissinger becomes, as a counterintelligence agent, a very successful Nazi hunter, taking on board the key assumption that you can draw a line between the Nazis and ordinary Germans. This is in some measure a fictitious line, but it's a necessary fiction if you're to make anything of post-war Germany. So he spends quite a substantial period of time, to the summer of 1947, trying to contribute to the creation of a stable Germany, a stable Western-oriented Germany. Then he comes back, but he leaves the applications rather late. Some of you here tonight, I know, have just completed your university applications last night. So imagine Kissinger's kind of missing the deadline. He was having quite a good time in occupied Germany by the summer of 1947. He had his dog Smokey. He had a nice girlfriend. They were having
He had a German girlfriend?
He had a German girlfriend. This was part of the saga.
Yeah. We don't have time, unfortunately, to focus on Smokey the dog, which is a
wish we did.
It's a major figure in the book.
Smokey
actually.
the dog is a very important figure. The
Yeah.
first dog the Kissinger family had, I suspect.
Yes.
Anyway, he applies to all the Ivy League universities late, and they all decline on the grounds of lateness, except Harvard, which bends the rules to admit this young man under the GI Bill. Could never have afforded to go otherwise. So he finds himself at Harvard in the fall of 1947 with Smokey the dog illegally in the dorm. And this begins an entirely new chapter in his life, the academic chapter.
Obviously, had he gone to Princeton to do the PhD, he would have been much greater. I mean, we all know that. That's obvious.
I couldn't possibly comment on that.
Yeah, okay.
He still couldn't have become president.
No, probably not, no. Although, if his joke is true, that the illegal they could do right away, the unconstitutional takes longer, then...
Rabbi, I'm glad you've pointed out that
yes.
that was a joke.
Yes.
Because all too often those lines have been taken out of context and represented as a serious and terribly sinister statement.
Yes, no, I knew it was a joke. I mean, those who know me know I don't like to make jokes. I find that detracts from the seriousness
I can tell.
of a conversation, but if properly placed. This is a remarkable place, Harvard, when he comes to class of 1950. And it features minds there at Harvard when he's there that will go on to impact government and public affairs. Arthur Schlesinger, Samuel Huntington, Zbigniew Brzezinski. But even more remarkable is the patriotism at Harvard that you describe there. Or in your words, you basically say that the Harvard professors are dedicated to uniting themselves to help America win the Cold War. That's Harvard of the 1950s. By the 1970s, you know, it's all changed, and you have this remarkable conversation between Kissinger and Nixon disparaging academics. And you write that today the academy is rife with indignation about this former patriotic bent, as if there were something fundamentally wrong about professors contributing to the defense of their country, end quote. So, as a historian who's been teaching at Harvard for 10 years, so what happened over these 20 years, and what can you say about the school where you are now and the schools that are forming the next generation, the future national security advisors?
You've asked really for me to give a potted history of two generations of Americans. Because in many ways, the story of Kissinger's life is the story of a generational divide. The ultimate generation gap in modern American history opened up in around about 1968. And it was a gap between those who had fought in World War II or in Korea and had no real doubt in the 1950s and in the early 1960s that there was evil in the world. Its political form was totalitarianism, and its military form was the Red Army and the Soviet nuclear arsenal. That generation came into collision with a younger generation who arrived at college in the late 1960s. We tend to refer to this generation as the baby boomers. The significant thing is that they were born after the war, and they came of age with a completely different sensibility, political, cultural, you name it. That generational collision shaped this country and continues to shape it to this day. Some people cannot read this book, certainly people of a certain age, without reverting to positions, to attitudes that they had in the late 60s and early 1970s. I notice some reviewers essentially don't review the book, they review Henry Kissinger. And they review the early Henry Kissinger. This book covers the first half of his life entirely in terms of the later Henry Kissinger. Harvard was just one of all the universities that went through this great generational collision. And it produced absurdities. Kissinger himself writes about this in 1968, referring to the student left of that time. How on earth can these people who claim to be democratic idolize the likes of Ho Chi Minh and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara? Can't they see that these are not democratic figures at all? I heard a funny story this summer, which I'll share with you, which gives a flavor of the time. Sometimes I go to Martha's Vineyard in the summer. So did Robert McNamara. One occasion when McNamara was going at the height of the Vietnam War.
When he was
Defense Secretary under Lyndon Johnson. First, he was threatened to be thrown off the ferry. And then...
By the guy operating the ferry?
No, I think it was not one of the
Yeah.
sailors. Generally speaking, people doing that kind of thing supported the war in Vietnam. It was
The people on vacation were
It was the
against the war.
educated elite who were inclined to throw McNamara off the boat. Then he got to Chilmark to see a North Vietnamese flag flying over one of the farms in Martha's Vineyard. I mean, this is a bit like Jane Fonda having a go on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun. So it's very hard for us today to recapture the intensity of animosities in that period. But there's no question that Henry Kissinger became a lightning rod for that younger generation's anger, their fury, their incomprehension of, as he would put it, the realities of power. That's really a big theme of the book. It will be a big theme of Volume 2 when I come to write it.
If I may ask, so...
Slightly dodged your question there.
Yeah, well, so if I may ask, and in the university today, is there any sense of American exceptionalism or patriotism?
Yes. I say this carefully because it's dangerous to caricature our universities today. There is unquestionably an overwhelming preponderance of liberal politics at Harvard as at Princeton, although I think Princeton's worse. I think nobody at all on the entire Princeton payroll voted for Mitt Romney, whereas possibly as many as 10 employees of Harvard cast their votes for the Republicans.
All the janitors.
Mike Bloomberg made a great speech about this at commencement over a year ago now. But if you actually look at the university as a whole, despite the political skew, there are some clearly dedicated patriots. Ash Carter, who's currently serving as Defense Secretary, is a friend and a colleague. Nobody could question his patriotism and his dedication to this country's national interest. I look at the students, and I'm struck by how different today's students are in their outlook from the students of 1968. There's a strong commitment to what we might call national improvement. I'll give you an example. Today I wrote a letter of reference for a young man whose ambition is to contribute to an improvement in the public education system of this country. He wants to really dedicate his life to addressing some of the obvious and glaring failings in our junior and high school system. So I don't despair. I'm actually struck by the idealism, and I use the word advisedly since it's a part of the title of this book, the idealism of this generation. And I'm not as pessimistic as some are about where we're headed. Do you know the thing that gives me the most hope? We've a generation of young men and women who served in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who've returned from those wars, and substantial numbers have returned to education, and we find them at the Kennedy School, at the business school. I had 6 in one of my classes last semester. This generation, just watch them. Watch this generation as they come through the schools of public policy and business schools and enter public life. My faith and hope is that these young people who have an amazing sense of public service and a knowledge of the world will start to appear in our legislatures at the state level and ultimately in our political life. And I think that will possibly do something to take us back to the 50s era, when a generation who'd served their country at war came home full of ideals and with a clear understanding that there is evil in the world. I mean, that I think is a reason for cautious optimism.
Wow. So Kissinger launches himself as a public intellectual, writes a book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, allies himself with Nelson Rockefeller, and connects himself to his political future. And as you describe in the book later, he actually visits Vietnam, which you just mentioned. It's a fascinating description of how Kissinger actually goes to Vietnam and understands immediately and with great foresight the problems of the American Vietnamese policy. Everyone today speaks about the lessons of Vietnam, but every single person, when they say that phrase, they mean something totally different. I mentioned in our private conversation, a Saturday Night Live before the first Gulf War began once with Dana Carvey as the first President Bush, and he's assuring Americans, he says to them, "My fellow Americans, do not worry. This will not be another Vietnam, for we have learnt well the lesson of Vietnam. Stay out of Vietnam." Okay. Now, what lessons does Kissinger has famously said, he says this often, that Americans learned the wrong lessons from Vietnam. So what are the lessons of Vietnam for Kissinger, and how are these values, how are these lessons of value for us today in American foreign policy today?
This is one of the most fascinating episodes in this book, and it's surprising to Kissinger's critics, and I'd be amazed if there were no Kissinger critics here tonight. He's often represented as if he enjoyed the Vietnam War so much he didn't want it to stop. And that's certainly the image that Christopher Hitchens tried to create in his book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. The young Kissinger began to have his doubts about Vietnam as early as 1963, at the time of the coup against Diem in Saigon. In 1965, he did something that Harvard professors don't do enough. He went there. I mean, generally speaking, Harvard professors like to pontificate about policy issues from their Harvard studies, preferably in a chair like this. But Kissinger was always as much a veteran, as he was a professor. And in 1965, he went on a fact-finding mission, notionally as an advisor to the US ambassador in South Vietnam. And I was very struck by the enthusiasm with which he threw himself into flying around Vietnam, often over Viet Cong-occupied territory, trying to understand what was going on and what was going wrong. And he kept a diary, which is a terrifically good read, of this first visit. What he saw, and it helped that he had military experience, were two problems, which will have a certain familiarity when I tell you them. The first was a complete mismatch between the different US agencies that were active in Vietnam. The CIA, the Army, the Embassy, USAID, you name all the different agencies, and there were a whole bunch, all seemed to be pursuing completely different strategies in a completely bureaucratic disaster of poor organization. And at the same time, the government they're supposed to be helping, the government of South Vietnam, is chronically divided and indeed corrupt. Kissinger realizes quickly that this is hopeless. The US operation is dysfunctional, and the government it's supposed to be helping is also dysfunctional. And this is the beginning of his realization that you will need a diplomatic exit from this mess, that it's not winnable on this basis, even if you improve your actual war fighting. So what does this all imply today? Well, I think what we did in Iraq closely resembles these two problems. In that, if you look at the actual occupation, it was a pretty messy operation. It was poorly designed, it was poorly executed, it had to be salvaged by Dave Petraeus and Stan McChrystal. And at the same time, what we were trying to create, which was the government that eventually emerged under Maliki, was not actually viable. And indeed, since the US has withdrawn, Iraq has semi-disintegrated. So we haven't learnt terribly well from Vietnam, even although we keep saying we have. It seems to me that in many respects, all the pathologies that Kissinger identified in mid-1960 Vietnam, this is 65, remember? Even before the really major escalation that Johnson ordered that year, these pathologies were all there in Iraq. So my sense is that we have a long way to go before we've fully processed this history. And may I say a word about what I'm really trying to achieve with this book? Kissinger has taught me something important. And when I compare my understanding now with my understanding 10 or 11 years ago of the United States, it's this. I didn't fully understand when I wrote a book called Colossus in 2003-04 that the real problem that the United States has when it comes to wielding power is not about manpower or finance or even public opinion. The problem is that the American elite is incredibly bad at history. It's a history deficit that is the problem. And that is partly because we do not really treat history with enough respect in our educational system. It's a poor relation at Harvard. Economics lords it over us, and the students gravitate towards economics and political science and treat history as if it were on a par with basket weaving. But history is in fact more important than these various social sciences. And this book is really a work of applied history, showing that Kissinger's key advantage over his contemporaries was that he understood history mattered, and it mattered in the present, that knowing some Russian history or for that matter some Chinese history, was a pretty important prelude to doing any kind of negotiation with those countries. So this is a book of applied history. It's not just a book that will interest you if you're interested in the 1950s and 60s. This is living history. What it says seems to me to have all kinds of important implications for our own time.
That raises the question of how you connect this project of yours to your earlier projects. Many of your other, as you mentioned yourself, many of your other books have been sweeping. And interestingly, even though you are, to use your own term, a Scottish guy, you wrote a magisterial history of the Rothschild family and the impact of these Jews on Europe and on the empire. Is there any connection between that earlier work and what drew you to write about, I guess, the most famous Jew of the 20th century?
There is, in the sense that I have certain lifelong preoccupations. One of them is with power, what it is, and in particular with the things that historians tend to call empires, the great power structures that cross borders, cultural, religious, and national. And understanding American power is one of the great challenges of this part of my life. Understanding the paradoxes of American power, a power that cannot think of itself as an empire and cannot therefore perform imperial-type operations. I mean, let's face it, invading Mesopotamia and Afghanistan is not a new enterprise, but it's never been done before by a state that denies its an imperial power. And the second great preoccupation has to do with the Jews. I mean, the great puzzle of modernity is really the Jews. Their disproportionate contribution to every aspect of modernity, second only to the Scots.
Just want to note how great Professor Ferguson looks in this yarmulke, by the way.
But somehow not convincing.
We could talk about conversion in my office afterwards, if you want.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Because the paradox is the disproportionate contribution is associated with disproportionate persecution. And this is a problem. And Kissinger, in some ways, personifies this problem because I see in the vilification to which he's been subjected not an objective critique of US foreign policy between 1969 and 1976. I mean, one can make a critique, and Volume 2 certainly will be critical, just as this book is critical. But the critique that has been published of Kissinger's role in the Nixon and Ford years crosses the line, it seems to me, again and again, into something that I recognize from my work on the Rothschilds. Much that was written about the Rothschilds in the 19th and 20th century was blatantly anti-Semitic, and some of it was more subtly prejudiced. Much of the bile that has been directed at Kissinger has an anti-Semitic character, or is a kind of encoded prejudice, because there is no single standard being applied here. What I'm struck by is that acts of the early 1970s are singled out because they were associated with Kissinger for disproportionate invective. When, if you think of the things that are mentioned in the typical hostile books, similar things were done by every post-war American administration, and yet there's no book called The Trial of Dean Rusk. And you're looking in vain for critiques of the Eisenhower administration, which clearly was responsible for regime change in at least 2 countries, where there's no debating that the CIA was directly responsible for the coups in Iran and in Guatemala. So I think one of the problems that we have to grapple with, the coincidence of Jewish achievement and Jewish persecution, of anti-Semitic critiques, is here too. And this will be a big issue in Volume 2. I will be pushing very hard to establish some kind of meaningful and consistent standard by which we judge foreign policy, by which we judge administrations. Because I don't think I think that's not been the case in most assessments of Kissinger.
And of course, adding to that would be the fact that Nixon himself has this bizarre partnership with him, and yet the Jewish invective, which we know of him at the same time, is cringeworthy, to say the least.
This is a very difficult thing to figure out. Sometimes people forget that Nixon was president. He was in charge until really the disintegration of the presidency over Watergate. And he intended Kissinger to be his instrument. When Eisenhower heard that Nixon had appointed a professor, national security advisor, and a Harvard professor at that, he was aghast. He said, "You don't give professors real jobs like that." And I think part of Nixon's calculation was that he, the experienced politician, would be able to use Kissinger as an instrument of his will. And it is a very, very unlikely partnership. Once you've read this, you'll see just how completely extraordinary it is that Nixon offered Kissinger the job, because their relationship had been terrible to non-existent throughout the 1950s and 60s, to the point that Nixon tried to get in touch with Kissinger in 1960. And Kissinger went to the lengths of inventing a trip to Japan to avoid him. Now, if you really want to avoid somebody, you say, "I'm terribly sorry, I've got to go to Japan," because that really kills the idea of the meeting. It's not enough to say, "I've got to go to Boston." So I'm really struck by how unlikely the partnership was. And I think in Volume 2, I'll be emphasizing how dominant Nixon was as the president.
Fascinating. That Eisenhower story about the professor reminded me of when Senator Moynihan was running against Jim Buckley here. Senator Buckley said that, "I look forward to running against Professor Moynihan. I'm sure Professor Moynihan will run a campaign worthy of a Harvard professor." And so they asked Moynihan, "Why do you think Senator Buckley keeps calling you Professor Moynihan?" And Moynihan shakes his head and says, "The mudslinging has begun." So
there is no more damning word, really, than professor.
Professor.
It should always be said in a slightly sarcastic way, as in professor.
Professor, exactly. Two final questions. It's well known that Kissinger, after leaving office, has retained an enormous influence. People running for president want to be seen with him. He advises other governments, as well as prominent figures within our own government. To your knowledge, has this administration, the current one, been in any way interested in contacting and hearing advice from Henry Kissinger?
Are we on the record?
If you want to keep a secret, Professor Ferguson, all you need to do is tell 400 Jews. Because a Jewish secret, the definition of a Jewish secret is one you only tell one person at a time. So.
It is, I think, a matter of public record that Henry Kissinger has been to the White House on several occasions in this presidency. But I think it's also not a secret that he's not been consulted and his advice has not been sought in the ways that it has been by previous presidents. You only need to go back to his predecessor to see, Bob Woodward wrote about it, that when things started to go wrong in Iraq, Kissinger was called in. And indeed, one can go back through the presidencies, even to Clinton, certainly to Bush Sr., and Kissinger played an important role and was seen as a valuable resource long after he'd left government. Just to give an example, I came across a remarkable memorandum of a conversation between Kissinger and Deng Xiaoping in 1989, not long after the Tiananmen Square massacre, when it's very clear Kissinger was acting as an intermediary for the government, trying to make sure that relations didn't totally disintegrate over what had happened in Beijing. This president does not seem as interested as any president since Eisenhower in what Kissinger has to say. And I think one can see why, if one goes back to David Remnick's profile of President Obama in the New Yorker in January last year, when Obama said in the course of a discussion of foreign policy, "I don't even need George Kennan right now." Kennan, as you know, was in some ways the predecessor of Kissinger as a great strategic thinker who was the architect of the policy of containment of the Soviet Union. Now, it was very unfortunate that President Obama said that just a few weeks before the annexation of Crimea by President Putin, because it turned out that he really did need George Kennan, or at least somebody like him. I think it's fair to say that the White House has not made much use of the fact that Kissinger continues to have very high-level access in China, in Russia, and elsewhere in the world. And it is remarkable that a man of 92 continues to be sought out for his strategic advice by world leaders in all the major powers except the United States. That is strange.
Wow. Final question. I want to conclude by returning to the quote with which we began. History is to nations what character is to individuals. So if this is true, then building on your own work as an historian and speaking as a Scottish scholar who writes on Jews and on America, so what lessons should we draw in general from the history of the West as Jews and as Americans, as we face a world in turmoil and therefore an uncertain future? Jewish events like to end with worry, so it's...
So do Scottish events.
Yes.
The good news is we're doomed. We began, and you began, Rabbi, with some wise observations about the importance of Western civilization, its uniqueness, the extent to which it has transformed the whole world for the better in almost any dimension you care to name. It's something I tried to sum up in a book some of you may have read, Civilization. And I gave that book a provocative subtitle, The West and the Rest, to make it clear that there is something distinctive about the Western contribution. It not only gave us distinctive political institutions and the notion of a rule of law, it also achieved the scientific revolution. It made possible the great economic transformations that we call capitalism or the market. It brought about the medical transformation that doubled and then trebled life expectancy. It created the consumer society that makes life so much more comfortable than it was before. And it also gave us the work ethic that has kept us going. God knows, I've been talking incessantly today, and I just keep going. Not because it's enjoyable, but because it's the work ethic that propels me onwards. And all of these things really originated in what, for short, we call the West. But that basically means Western Europe and places where West Europeans settled. And the miracle of Western civilization's success was that it ultimately was able to synthesize the two monotheistic traditions, the Jewish and the Christian, and end the antipathy between them. This was a painful process, and it was not without its reverses, but I think it was irrevocably achieved. So the biggest problem that we have is that most people who inhabit the West, including the people who are responsible for teaching history, to a very large extent take all this for granted. Not only do they take it for granted, but they spend much more time criticizing it, finding fault with it, and emphasizing its defects than acknowledging its huge net benefits. And this means that our civilization suffers from the most dreadful malaise of all, and that is a loss of faith in itself. As I write history, I guess what I am always trying to do is to help us find that faith again, partly by reminding people what the alternatives to Western civilization were and are. My work on the Cold War is partly designed to remind older readers and tell younger readers what the Soviet Union and its satellites did, what they stood for, what unfreedom is. My students have no real conception of it. And my wife's work on the threat posed by Islamic extremism, I think, is concerned with the same project, to make people in this comfortable, prosperous, free society understand and imagine what unfreedom is like in all its hideous forms. And it's only by making ourselves aware of that contrast between what we've got and what the alternatives were and are that I think history can make a meaningful contribution. With that, I think I can only thank this audience.
Please join me in thanking our extraordinary guest. Thank you all, and Shabbat Shalom.